and welcome to this fall's production of Fisher Reads. This semester, our author is Henry David Thoreau. Before we start any discussion, we need to go right now to how we pronounce this name. There are two preferred pronunciations. How does our panel feel?
Thoreau.
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 All right, everyone pronounces it the same, which is Thoreau. But many people say Thoreau. So if you hear it both ways, that's okay. So we are talking about Thoreau this semester because it's the 200th anniversary of his birth. And we have amazing events in the month of October, starting with probably the most exciting one is the evening of October 10th, Tuesday, in Basil Auditorium at 7 o'clock. A Thoreau performer, Richard Smith, will be talking as if he is Thoreau in one of Thoreau's most famous essays called Walking. So everyone will want to see that. That will be fun. And there's many other events which we'll talk about in a little while. I think we have had many authors on Fisher Reads, but probably no author quite as versatile as Henry David Thoreau. He, as everyone probably knows, he wrote in the first half of the 19th century, and his writings touch on natural history, philosophy, poetry, environmental history. He was an abolitionist, wrote on that, and then most people probably know him as what we would call a conscientious objector, so even political science. So there is so much scope for angles of all sorts to be taken on this amazing writer. And he didn't write one, but there's even a graphic novel about his life.
Wow.
So he has hit every aspect of pop culture. The last event of Fisher Reads actually will be a movie about Walden, his most famous book. So let's get to our panelists. We have three panelists here today. Each of them are going to be taking a different angle during their events during Fisher Reads month. And I'd like them to introduce themselves and tell us what they'll be doing for the Fisher Reads events. And we'll start with Dr. Tim Madigan.
Well, I'm Tim Madigan from the Department of Philosophy, and I think if Thoreau lived longer, he would have written a graphic novel. He died too young. I've been fascinated by Henry David Thoreau since I was in high school when we read Walden, and I still remember the section there, the Battle of the Ants, which is a vivid description of red ants versus black ants, which I, as a kid, would watch. I would watch these battles, and nobody had ever written about such things. So I had read. So I had no idea at that time I'd become a professor of philosophy teaching Thoreau. But I've always had a soft spot for him. And for many, many years now, when I teach my introductory ethics class, I have the students read Civil Disobedience, as you mentioned, his idea of objecting in a civil way to laws that you don't feel are just. In this case, the war against Mexico, which he thought was essentially a land grab, a way for the United States to take land from Mexico, primarily as a way to promote more slave states. And very famously, he wouldn't pay his poll tax and went to jail in protest. And he's often considered a pacifist, somebody who believed in peaceful, nonviolent resistance. But I also have the students read his essay, A Plea for Captain John Brown, which is quite eye-opening because in it, Thoreau is talking about the trial of John Brown, who'd been arrested at Harper's Ferry for trying to violently overthrow slavery. And very famously in that essay, Thoreau says that John Brown has twice as much right to hang the governor of Virginia as the governor has to hang him. So it's quite interesting to compare and contrast this gentle man using such language and saying, why is it that he would support John Brown? And he was not an absolute pacifist. He thought the cause of slavery was so unjust, so horrific, that what John Brown did was really a call, literally a call to arms that had to be followed.
Great.
I'm Linda McCammon, and I'm in the Religious Studies Department. And one of the wonderful things about Fisher Reads, and this has happened every time we've gotten together to explore a text, is that it gives me an opportunity to read great work. this has been a revelation, no pun intended, but a revelation for me to read his work and particularly to read a biography of his life, because I think it's really important to connect who he was with what he wrote. And in my class, Ethics in Action, I'm really trying to get students to reconnect to themselves and to nature, and to understand the ethical import of that. And reading Thoreau clearly will help students understand the importance of really becoming conscious of the world around you, to really explore nature in its breadth and in its depth. And he did that at Walden, but he did that in walking, which Richard will be presenting and performing on the 10th. And to really see the value in every plant, every grass. He loved bogs. He just loved everything. And he loved rainstorms. He loved to immerse himself in nature. And he saw in nature power, reverence. And for him, that's the source of his spirituality, the source of his religious consciousness is in nature. And it has an ethical import to it. You can only be a certain kind of person springing from this love of nature and reverence for nature. So I'm hoping that as we explore these texts, because I'm having them read a little bit of everything, not everything, a little bit of, they'll kill me. No, they're gonna read
He wrote a lot.
They're going to read a little bit of, they're going to read Walking, parts of Civil Disobedience, and also Walden, because he was very concerned about, with the Industrial Revolution, the mechanization of society, the fact that we were moving away from our natural connection to the earth, and how important it is to really look at walking and to really walk, not go for a stroll, but you have to go for a walk, and I'm paraphrasing him, like you're going to go out and you're never coming back. You're just going to keep going, and you're going to continue to explore the earth. And that kind of fearlessness, that kind of enthrall with nature is something that I think nature scares more people than it enthralls these days. So I'm hoping that they're going to understand a different form of spirituality and what that means ethically in looking at his work. I'm very excited to start this part of the semester.
Great.
Hi everyone, I'm Rob Rule. I'm in the Department of Philosophy. And so I'm using Thoreau in my learning community on philosophy of friendship. And I've used his text before in that class because he has a wonderful, actually his first book failed miserably, and it only sold like 200 copies. But out of that, they took this one portion on friendship and what it means to be a friend. But also, so that it kind of works to help them think about friendship. But this semester, I've switched it up and I'm using civil disobedience in the class. And so one of the things that I want them to try to think about is what it means to be a friend, but then how also friendship enters into politics too. So they're reading a book on the philosophy of friendship, and they're going to be reading Thoreau right after they actually read this portion on what friendship is and how the feminists had friendships within the feminist movement and how that helped to shape the country. And so as we go through, the one thing that I'm interested in with Thoreau, and I've been reading him now really intently since a long time ago, about 20 years ago, I took a class on the global study of reincarnation. Oh, yeah. And right when I entered college, and I've always been fascinated about that intersection between philosophy, religion, and literature, and how that comes into politics, ethics, and economics. And so in Thoreau's work, he touches on all of these things. But for me, what was so important is what I call his kind of liberation philosophy that he has, and this ethic of preservative care. So going back to the environment, he has this sense that all things are moving in nature and the world, kind of like how Heraclitus said, you can't step into the same river twice, and everything's changing. And so for Thoreau then, part of our obligation is to stop, as he basically says in his first book, to stop damming these flows and to stop trying to constrain everyone and give them that ability to freely flow in a way that allows them to become who they are or who they want to be. And so for me, that's part of that important ethic concern, because in friendship, it's not about forcing the friend into who you think you want them to be, but helping to honor their gifts to become who they want to be, type of thing. So it's a very different shift, I think, and things are constantly changing with it. But the other dimension to Thoreau that I touch on is also his love for indigenous peoples and the realization of the dark underside of U.S. history and what we did to indigenous peoples. And for Thoreau, the two went hand in hand. The destruction of the natural world was also part of the destruction of indigenous communities. So for me, again, it's that philosophy, religion, literature, but then how it's a good comment on everyday life, politics, ethics, and economics.
So it's just striking how three things that you have said, the environmental urgency where we are living right now with climate change, protest as a patriotic act, and social relationships in this era of social media, how you all are saying that a person who wrote more than 100 years ago is still incredibly relevant. How would you persuade students that this is something that if they read it, it will not sound like it's written to a bygone age, but really written to us? Can you talk about your personal experiences of reading something and how that happened for you?
Well, actually, I'm also teaching a bioethics course right now, and there's an article by a philosopher, George Annis, about organ transplantation, and the question, how do we determine if there's a limited number of organs, who should get it? And he had a line in there, which I'd forgotten, that basically said, Henry David Thoreau would probably not have gotten an organ because he was a failure in his time. I mean, he didn't sell many books. Even many of his friends thought he was kind of a ne'er-do-well, and yet his influence has been so great. So that's a kind of telling line. How do we know the importance of someone in their own time? That they'll, we will be reading somebody so many decades or 100 years or 200 years now after his birth. So I think one of the relevance is he's still very readable, and as you say, he still is applicable. It's always pointed out that civil disobedience influenced Gandhi and Tolstoy and Martin Luther King, and the idea that you have to take a stand. One of the things we often forget is the abolitionists were really a small minority of people. Even amongst the folks in Concord and Boston, to say it's not just that slavery should not be allowed, but that there's equality amongst all human beings. Because even some of the abolitionists thought, well, once slavery is ended, hopefully all these slaves will go back to Africa. So when you read him, in some ways what he says seems, oh, of course, that's obvious, but it wasn't obvious in his time. And that's why we don't know some of the issues today that are being debated. But 100 years from now, people look back and say, why didn't more people take these stands?
I also think that he is an American original. He is such an original thinker, and he, you can read it. You read his passion. You feel it in what he's writing. And I've been trying in my classes to talk about living an authentic existence. And you don't always have to go along with what everybody else is doing. He was certainly a nonconformist in that way.
He marched to the beat of a different drummer.
He did indeed. And he lived his life authentically. He had tremendously close, intimate relationships. He worked incredibly hard. I mean, no one could ever accuse of Henry David Thoreau of being lazy, although some people, I'm sure, thought, as you say, he was a ne'er-do-well. But he lived his life authentically and with tremendous passion. And I think that is that will excite students once they get into, I mean, there's no question that you have to get into his reading, his writing, actually. But once you're in, once you understand who he is, it's completely enthralling.
For me, going through and reading him, the one thing that I loved is basically the sense that critique is patriotic, right? To live an unreflective, uncritical life is not patriotism. It is basically conforming to the status quo and not really knowing if things are right or wrong. And so I think that that's very crucial for being a person, a human being, a citizen, is this sense that let me think things through for myself. Let me look at this situation. Let me decide if this is really ethical or not. I'm not going to depend on someone on the news telling me that it's right or wrong, or some politician. And as Thoreau knew, a lot of people supported slavery going through, and he knew that was unjust. He thought manifest destiny was unjust. And he was more than willing to say, especially in his writings on New England and Massachusetts and slavery, basically, if Massachusetts didn't stand up against slavery and the injustice of slavery, there was slavery in Massachusetts, basically, per se, right? So if we aren't going to take part in resistance, or at least if we aren't going to take part in critiquing it and saying, I'm not going to support it in any way, whether through taxes or through products, we are part of the problem. And I think that's hard for a lot of people today to admit to, that if we don't take a stand or step back and say, I'm not going to be part of it, then we are in some way supporting it. And so I think it gets to the very heart of who we are as people. In civil disobedience, he says, you have no right to basically steal a plank or a board that somebody else is using because they're drowning so you can live, right? You have no right to live your life off of somebody else's labor or life and basically steal their life from them so you can live. And so I think that it really pushes us to a higher ethical standard in a time when we don't always take ethics seriously.
You mentioned too the friendship circles. Of course, he was good friends with Ralph Waldo Emerson and Nathaniel Hawthorne and Margaret Fuller. And there's, I don't know if it's apocryphal or a true story, but said that when Thoreau was jailed for not paying his tax, Emerson came to see him in the jail and said, Henry, what are you doing here? As if it's kind of ridiculous that you're behind bars. And his response was, Ralph, why aren't you here with me?
Right.
All the other people who say they oppose slavery, didn't pay their poll tax, there aren't enough prisons to hold us all. So that's still an inspirational story that, he walked the walk literally as well as talked the
And
talk.
that was kind of a source of tension between Thoreau and Emerson, that you really did have two ways of approaching the big ideas, whereas Emerson was really kind of the theoretical, he really thought through these things, but Thoreau was a man of action. He really acted on what his beliefs were. He really was a man of conscience, really was willing to go to jail. I mean, and he was there for what, one
night.
One night.
I think one of his family members paid the tax.
Yeah. But he
Which
didn't ask
angered
him
him.
to.
He
Yeah,
hated
he
the
did,
fact
yeah.
that they did it.
Oh,
He was like, they should have left me here.
But he has this marvelous passage where he talks about everything he did for that one night. And it was so amazingly interesting. He talked about everything, the people he met. It was like you were in the jail cell with him, because he was so observant about everything. He just drank it all in.
Well, I think that's an interesting point, because the passage that makes it into civil disobedience, the longer passage of being jailed, makes it into A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers and into Walden. And he goes in there, and especially though in civil disobedience, what he basically says is, people don't realize how free I am in here for doing the right thing and knowing that I'm standing for justice, compared to all the people who are out there who think they're free, but still following the dictates of unjust laws and unjust processes. And so there is a deep sense that you can have all the physical freedom in the world to buy 100 different cereals, to buy, all of this different stuff in the store, but that doesn't mean that you are free. Whereas there he is in prison saying, I know I did the right thing for the right reasons, and I am free to be who I am, even though you will imprison me. You can never imprison me fully. I am still a free person.
What was his educational and religious background?
Well, he went to Harvard,
He did.
so he had,
Which it's kind of interesting, because when you read about what Harvard was like in those
Yeah.
days, it's nothing like we imagine Harvard to be.
but it was still snooty.
Yes, it was, but it was a pretty sparse existence, pretty hardcore.
Well, and I mean, again, one of the differences going off of that is he graduated when he was basically about 20 years old from Harvard. So he went there when he was around 15 or 16. And they still had pigs and chickens in the yard and going through, and students, they had a student revolution there type of thing, or revolt. And people used to, they say in the one autobiography of him, that they used to take meat and stick it up underneath the table with the fork so they could come back later and get it because Harvard didn't give them enough to eat.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
That's
it was pretty
funny.
rough. And his parents, they had to make decisions and really sacrifice, as many students can relate to be able to go to Harvard. And his, you were asking about-
Religious background.
Oh, religious
Is he
background.
a transcendentalist? His friends were, so
Well,
was he?
that movement kind of emerged in the early 19th century in America. It was previously in Europe, but he was part of this, well, he sort of went slowly into it. It was the Unitarian, it was kind of a family feud within the Unitarian religion, and there was a group that broke off and they became the Transcendentalists. And he was kind of reserved. He didn't really get on the bandwagon exactly, but he did slowly start to move toward a transcendentalist religious perspective, you might say. But he was really such an original thinker. He had his own spirituality, and really transcendentalism as a movement, there was no creed per se, there was no unified understanding of what it was. It was just a very open form of spirituality that just really had this belief that there was this spirit or sacred dimension, and you could tap into it in any number of ways. One of the primary ways was through nature, and that was your reason for being. You were trying to connect to that. It was very Eastern in that regard. It was highly influenced by Eastern religion, and of course Thoreau read Confucius, and he read Hindu. He loved the Bhagavad Gita, for example, loved Eastern. Apparently Emerson had a marvelous library, which you would expect. And when he stayed, because he did stay with Emerson for quite some time, and so he just would go in there and just ravenously digest the books. So,
Well, he was also, the movement was also deeply influenced by Immanuel Kant, too.
Yes,
So
it
you
was,
had to get the
yes.
philosopher in there.
that's right, the whole transcendental,
And there-
existential.
I think too, one thing, during that time and that period, Calvinism, which was a form of Christianity, Protestant form of Christianity, basically had a very low view of humanity,
Yeah.
right, and the sinful nature of humanity. Then the Unitarian movement starts to break out of this and starts to basically say, well, no, humans aren't bad. There's a spark of the divine kind of in us, if you want to say it that way, self-culture in the image of God. And then the Transcendentalists started to say, well, that's still too constrained of a way of seeing things, and so let's take in Buddhism, Hinduism, these different religious traditions.
And the native.
Yeah,
Yes,
the
yes.
indigenous components, and Pan and Thoreau
Yes.
going out and actually worshiping in nature. And so out of this, it's a move away from that view that only Christianity can be the religion,
Yes.
to a lot of different ways of communing with
Right,
God.
and so you can imagine how well that went over. At that time, it was not looked upon favorably, and there were all kinds, he would get into trouble about this, because he was on the lecture circuit, if you wanted to call it that, but he would give lectures a lot of the time, and that was one of the venues through which you'd had the culture wars at that time, was through these lectures and people
That's
attending
true.
the lectures and speaking out against the lecturer.
And heckling him.
Heckling, and he got into all kinds of trouble with that, And Emerson, in order to be able to make ends meet, he had to lecture quite a bit, and he went into Europe
Yeah.
for one lecture circuit, and Thoreau stayed at his house and really was kind of the male present there in the home with Emerson's wife and children. And he was a great person with kids. He loved children, and he enjoyed spending a great deal of time. And oftentimes Thoreau is looked upon as kind of a cold fish, but nothing could be further from the truth. His relationships with Emerson's children were very warm and close. And in fact, when Emerson's young son died, Thoreau was just devastated by his death. I think it was scarlet fever. Did
Yeah.
he die from that?
At the
And he
same
was-
time, his brother
His
died.
brother.
Yeah, he's very close with his
Very
family,
close
too.
with
Yeah.
His brother, yeah.
It's, there's a great quote, I forget if it's in Walden, but where Thoreau says there's nothing wrong with building castles in the air. You just have to build the foundations for them too.
Right.
And that's why I think he and Emerson were such friends, because they complemented each other. That Emerson is often hard to read because he's too airy and too abstract, whereas when you read Thoreau, he's very grounded. We're talking about his nature writing. He really meticulously recorded the growth of plants and the different trees that he saw. To sort of say, you know, I'm all for this transcendentalism in the inspirational sense, but what's the foundation?
Yeah, and you know, and he was early on in his career, he was actually criticized. He was called like a mini Emerson, you know, because he really did admire Emerson so much. But one of the things I admire so much about Thoreau is the fact that he broke away from that. You know, we can all sort of get caught up in the cult of personality with Emerson, but he disagreed with him on some basic things, and he found his own way, he found his own voice, and it was really such an original American voice, and I admire that about him.
But I think going back off of the idea, some have used the idea it's found in a lot of writings on him, but he was a descendentalist, right? So it wasn't a transcendentalist. And so
That's good.
he was going down, it was a dropping down into the earth.
Interesting.
And so this descendentalist, but so one of the things that's important is that he talks about being able to not have to look up above us for God somewhere out in the other world, but how do you connect with God who is kind of around us in the earth? And it's really about grounding yourself.
And I love when he says, because talking about breaking the idea of man against nature or humans against nature, he says we are nature.
Yes,
It's-
yes.
Nature is us. It's not this something outside of us.
So thank you. Let's talk a little bit about the events.
Oh,
So I
those.
mentioned the performance. Is there
Yeah.
one or two other events you want to highlight? And also, Linda, tell everyone where they can go to find out more about any events.
Okay, well, I understand that there's going to be things up on the website about the various events, and we'll be sending out lots of information about it.
And what's the name? Is that website on Fisher's main page?
Yes,
Yeah.
it should be.
Okay.
So
Fisher Reads? Should
Fisher
be
Reads.
Fisher Reads.
That's right. Fisher Reads Henry David Thoreau.
All right.
And so, as you mentioned, on the 10th is the performance by Richard Smith, and he's going to be performing walking and then answering questions from the audience in his Thoreau persona. The next day he'll be in Basil Auditorium at 11:15 to have kind of an informal conversation in his Thoreau is gone. He's going to be Richard Smith, the historian. Talking about Thoreau and his life and work. And then we also have some really interesting discussions on tap. On the 17th at the lower level of the Lavery Library, we have a Fisher Reads faculty discussion. Faculty from economics, poli-sci, philosophy, ethics, religion will be giving short presentations to look at Thoreau's work, and the title of that is 200 Years Later, Is Thoreau Still Relevant? We all think he is, so I think that those who attend will find that to be the case. And then we also, in the formal Wilson Formal on the 23rd, there will be a student presentations on Thoreau's work. For civil disobedience, past and present. And Jane Snyder's class of students will be giving...
From legal studies.
That's right,
Great.
legal studies will be giving presentations. And then you also mentioned on the 26th, there will be a film, Walden, The Ballad of Thoreau. And this is a really interesting film because it combines documentary facts with a theatrical presentation of this play that was written about Walden. And you see Thoreau and Emerson together and engaging. So it's a wonderful film. And so there will be Fisher Reads faculty on hand for some Q&A after the film presentation.
Fantastic. Well,
Yeah.
that is a big diversity of events, and I think they will all be fun. I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Tim Madigan, Dr. Linda McCammon, and Dr. Rob Rule for being our panelists. I'm Deb Vanderbilt from the English department, and I want to end with my favorite Thoreau quote, which I found my best friend in high school used this for her senior quote in the yearbook. Thoreau said, "I was determined to know beans." Thank you.